Salam and welcome to our YouTube channel Dispatches. For Somali related news and information, please visit somalidespatch.com. I'm Abdulqadir Guled. Somali Parliament has on May 15 of this year elected Hassan Sheikh Mohamud for Somalia's 10th president. This is President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud's second non-consecutive term in office, a first in the country's history. The president has appointed Hamze Abdi Barre as the country's 21st prime minister. Both President Hassan and Prime Minister Hamze face daunting internal and regional security and political challenges as they take the helm. To discuss the ways and options the leaders have to maneuver these challenges, we've contacted Professor Abdirizaq Warfa. Professor Warfa is an educator and the author of Cries in the Hinterland, the Untold Stories of Somali Region. Salam Abdirizaq Warfa, and welcome back to Somali Dispatch. Thank you for your time this evening. If you can start us off by going over some of the regional and internal issues Somalia continues to face as the new president and prime ministers take office.
Thank you, Abdulqadir, for having me again. Glad to join you. So obviously there are a lot of challenges that will face the new government. From my perspective, I think there are four unique ideas that the new government has to deal with internally: security, stability, peace, and development. But all those four things, security, peace, and stability especially, have external factors, right? Including interference from regional governments. So that have their own interests looking at within this, right? And then we cannot also ignore Somalia somehow becoming indirectly a proxy battleground for states such as the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, as well as a proxy battle for US and China, right? So all of those complicate what the new government must face. But I think if they go through those in terms of priorities, there's a lot they can achieve. So the main issue is stability, right? It's the government has to, one of the things that was huge issue for all Somali governments was the lack of stability. Now, part of it is structural, right? Part of it is structural because in this Somalia, you obviously have a president and then you have a prime minister. Although the president elects the prime minister, and it selects, I should say, right? Because it's not really an elected position. The president is choosing who will be the prime minister. But after that, they have equal power, right? So really you have a government with two folks who have the same power leading the executive branch. So that's more of a structural. So I think one of the reasons why this selection of the new Prime Minister Hamze is important is that it's someone the president has a long history with. They were the same body right before they entered into politics. They were both in the same circles, right? Hamze was the Secretary General of the president's body. So hopefully that will provide an stability factor, since they're familiar with each other coming from the same body, and the president doesn't have to deal with somebody from opposing groups. But overall, I think that would be the challenge. Is this going to be a new way of doing business that provides stability over the course of the president's term? Or would we be back to the same original square one, where there's a conflict between the president and the prime minister, and then that leads to instability within the government, firing or letting go of the prime minister, and then restarting this whole process? I remember in his first term, he went through 3 different prime ministers, the President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud. So I think number one issue that they have to deal with is provide stability. Once you have stability, then there's that internal conflicts that I'm sure we will talk about in terms of regional states and how to deal with all these other players.
Okay, that was great. You know, one thing that comes to mind is the dynamic between those who went abroad, got educated, and went back to Somalia and got involved in the political arena versus those who never left. And the combination always was somewhat the source of misunderstanding between elected president and appointed prime minister. Now, both Hassan Sheikh, the currently elected president, and his appointee, Prime Minister Hamze, never lived outside of the country significantly, outside of getting, perhaps maybe educated and coming back to the country. How much is that going to contribute in accomplishing some of the goals you've and tackling some of the challenges you outlined in your opening?
Yeah, you're pointing out to something that a lot of people shed light on, and that is that perhaps all the folks who were selected to become prime ministers lack their local context to understand the dynamics of the Somali politics, because they will always come from diaspora. So this is interesting, right? Because we have the first time, there's a lot of firsts here, but we have the first time that somebody who is local in terms of never leaving the country, other than when he was getting his education. Remember, he went to get his degree from Yemen and then his second degree from Malaysia. So other than his education journey, he is very much local, born and grew up in the Jubaland, Kismayo, and was always involved in the dynamics of the Somali politics locally. Have a lot of, it's coming from the civil society that were there throughout all the tumultuous period of the Somali. But I still think, though, even though I think that's loss, right? But I still think it's more structural than whether somebody was coming from diaspora or is from local. I still think the problem still lies with the fact that these are two individuals, the president and prime minister, that the Constitution gives them equal power, essentially, right? And they always go back to the power that's given to them by the Constitution. I think more than being a local, what would help this and provide that dynamic stability that we're discussing here is the fact that there are two folks who know each other, had worked together before, same at university, they were both teachers there. So they have a long history of working together with each other. I think that's more of what's going to provide that stability than being a locally selected prime minister. But it's an interesting question, because now we have to say, okay, was it really the fact that he was local that helped? And answer that question of the diaspora folks were always the issue. Was it the fact that they have a long history together that helped, right? So it complicates it. But I think this would be the best combination we have seen so far, because this is one where the president had a complete control of who will be the prime minister without worrying about making sure that the opposition parties, right, opposing folks have a say in who is going to be the prime minister. So to me, that is what's going to provide a little bit of more stability overall.
Right. If we unpack both the external and the internal challenges that you've outlaid, let's start with the external challenges, such as East versus West, competing interests, as you said, from the Gulf countries, and of course, there's other factors. How can the government best maneuver within those challenges and perhaps gain some traction in resolving some of those issues?
Yeah, and it's one of those challenges that are very prolonged and would require a long time, right? But I think if they put the Somali interest before anyone else's interest, then they can make headways. So both the president and the prime minister have to understand they are in public office for solely Somali interests, not the Gulf, not the regional, not East versus West. Obviously, your interest could be with one of the Gulf states. It could be with the East, it could be with the West. But what has to drive any political interactions with any of these external forces has to be what is good for Somalia, what is the best decision for Somalia. If they make that their principle, right, you have to be really principled and say, this is Somali interest. If that's what's driving their decisions and the decisions in terms of who to become allies with, who to lean onto, right, then there can be good things coming out of Somalia. But if what's driving the decision is, for example, who is going to give us the most money, right, then you have a problem, because now you're not looking at Somali interests, you're looking at how can I pay these soldiers? Oh, for example, Qatar is going to give us most bucks, so let's go with Qatar. That's not going to solve the problems. It's just going to create a bigger problem for you, right? So I think that's the key. The key is whose interest are you serving? Whose interest are you serving? If it's the Somali interest, then it will be fine.
Right. It's always best to resolve issues but not create others in the meantime. There's always the Horn of Africa issues. As you know, Djibouti, and you're currently joining us from Ethiopia and Somali Region in Jigjiga. And then there's the SAS Afwerki interest in Somalia. Obviously, there's the CAT and the political interest of Kenya. Those challenges that are facing the new administration, if you can shed some light on in what they are and how to best maneuver in your perspective, would be great.
Yeah, I mean, like you said perfectly, there are a lot of players in this corner of the world, right? And it just happens that Ethiopian interest is different from Kenyan interest, which means Somalia becomes a battleground for proxy war between these states. Obviously, Djibouti is there. They have their own interest to play. And then Eritrea, as you mentioned. Even though people think that Eritrea and Ethiopia are aligned, remember, they're also having interest, right? So, for example, in interactions with Eritrea, we know there are Somali soldiers, about 5,000 or so, who are there right now, right? So that's an interest that can drive interactions with Eritrea. How do you get those soldiers back peacefully and interact such that Eritrea is willing to send them back, regardless of the interaction that they had with the former president? Ethiopia is an issue, right? Because we have a long tortured history with Ethiopia. And obviously, as I would have if I'm Ethiopian, they would interfere because that is what serves their best interest. So these are mines on the ground that the new administration has to wiggle through carefully. I think one advantage here is the fact that President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud, this is his second cup of tea. He already have one cup of tea in the villa, right? So at least that experience should guide him in how to deal with Ethiopia, how to deal with Kenya. We are going to live together in this part of the region. So it's not going to serve to be enemies with Kenya, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Eritrea. The goal is, how do we peacefully live in this part of the world? That's why I said the four things that are facing this is security, stability. Peace was one of them, right? Both internally and externally. How do you convince Ethiopia and Abiy that direct interference with Somali politics is not the best interest of Ethiopia? What is the best interest of Ethiopia is having a stable and peaceful Somalia, right? How do we convince Kenya that, hey, we know you have your own interests here, but again, Somalia at peace with itself and with the world is in the best interest of Kenya. Now, that is easier said than done. And it's got to take relying on his past history. 4 years he was in Somalia. What has he learned from interactions with Kenya? Because Kenya is still the same political body that he dealt with, right? Ethiopia is different. TPLF was in the power when Hassan Sheikh Mohamud was. Abiy is different. Abiy is behaving differently. So you gotta figure out what is it that Abiy wants, right? What is it the hand that Abiy is playing, and how can I use that hand to extend Somali interests, right? Again, I will always come back to deal with these groups with always thinking about how can I put on the table the best thing, to figure out what is the best way to deal with Abia, what is the best way to deal with Kenya. Djibouti is a little bit more complicated. We have that Somali connection, but you have a government that also has interactions with Ethiopia, has interactions with Eritrea. Obviously, they're gonna look at Djiboutian interest. So you have to think of it that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So yeah, and it's also worth noting that all of these countries, except perhaps with Eritrea, have troops representing the African Union in Somalia, and their role is also to be considered when dealing with these governments and their sometimes competing interests. Now, if we can turn our eyes to the countries'
especially,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, especially I think, like you said, especially when they are part of the military here, just to keep their interests, right? Not necessarily to keep the, but it's complicated because the Somali government, unfortunately, is relying on those shelters to keep peace. So how do you fight with the hand that, yeah, double whammy.
Yeah, for sure. Now, to talk about the country's internal political and security challenges, politically, what sort of consensus is needed from Somalia to address, for example, the regional issues between the feds and the local administrations?
So I think one of the things that's most crucial is do not repeat the mistakes of the past president, and actually even the early days of President Hassan, where he also picked fights with both Hinterland and Jubaland. I think Puntland is safe because they precede both latest administrations, but the new guns in the corner, right? Jubaland and Hirshabelle were an issue. So what they need to do is, right, establish a working relationship that is beneficial to both the regional states and the federal government. But one of the things that has to happen is to clarify what is the role of the regional, right, administrations, and what is the role of the federal government. I don't think it's a good idea to go back to the dream of having strong centralized federal government. It has to be one that's willing to give in some things to the regional administrations. But the regional administration also have to understand that the federal government has a role to play in how affairs of the regional administrations are run. But still, that is something that's not clear. And now here is, again, 4 years that informs an experienced president, right, who knows had these fights before. So what fights? Don't be unnecessary fights. I think that's the key, right? Don't be unnecessary fights that don't do much for the federal government, and yet put the regional administrations in unattainable situation.
Right.
They're here to stay. They're here to stay. So we need to figure out how to deal with it.
Right. It's also would be interesting to see how the administrations that were local administrations that were aligned with former president react to the new president's policies. There's also the ongoing Al-Shabaab dilemma for every administration in Somalia. With President Hassan's last go at this, he seemed to have a relative success in pushing back the militants. What could be expected from him and his administration this time around?
Yeah, I think security is number one issue. I think they still have a lot of presence in Mogadishu. I think, how do you deal with that, right? Forget about the regional areas that they're in full control of. We're talking about Mogadishu itself, where Al-Shabaab is still able to collect local taxes from business people. So if nothing else, I think security has to be the top priority. From my perspective, stability is first. Make sure that they have because you can achieve a lot of these goals if you have a stable executive administration where the prime minister and the president are working hand in hand. But once you have established that relationship, what are the other things that you need to tackle? That's one of the reasons why I say don't pick unnecessary fights with the regional administrations, because you have a bigger pie to worry about, and that's Al-Shabaab. How do you deal with them? Do you negotiate with them? Is that even a possibility? Or do you use of force, right? Because there's really no other alternative. You're dealing with one of those two, right? It's either or. It's not an situation here. So they have to put a lot of energy in dealing with that issue, because it's it's the reason a lot of these UN-sponsored, that's why they're in Mogadishu, right? If there was no Al-Shabaab, then the regional military would not have been in the state, right? They would be living. So you got to figure out that. I think if I were to be very straightforward, I'm very frank, I see two things that the president and the current administration must make sure they achieve over the course of the first 4 years. Deal with Al-Shabaab and security, make sure that by the end of their term, at least we are very close, if not already established, one man, one vote, right? I think those are two essential components for having to deal with all the issues that Somalia faces. Obviously, the constitution is still unfinished business, right? So in addition to those two top priorities, now you have to add dealing with the provisional constitution. It's a tall order for 4 years. It's a tall order for 4 years. But they have to deal with security.
Right. And lastly, how can the new administration, to add another layer to what they have to achieve within this 5-year term, how do they best approach the Somaliland-Somalia issues? I say issues because there are a multitude of contentious but solvable things that this administration could do, such as international funding of developmental projects being allowed to trickle down to Somaliland, perhaps and other regions, and business and economic independence. Your take on how to best tackle the Somaliland?
I totally agree with the suggestion that they should not hold international aid to Somaliland, because it's the region needs it. Whether we have an overall agreement or not with Somaliland and Somalia, we should no country should use international funds as a weapon to control any other region. So I think it's a good gesture too, that says, hey, we understand the issues, so we can talk. So it's a good gesture that they have to allow international development, not hold it. It's obviously a complicated story with two minds. Somaliland is on one mind, Somalia is on another mind. But I think the issue of Somaliland for this administration, other than being in good terms and not creating unnecessary problems and conflict with Somaliland, right? I don't think Somaliland should be a priority for them at this point. I think they have to worry about security first, stabilizing the South. Once you have those things, then we can talk about the Somaliland issue. First, get the house in order, right? Get Somalia in order, then you can deal with Somaliland. But I agree with you, there shouldn't be any holds on things that create problems, right? Because when you hold back international aid, you're sending a signal, right? But it doesn't really, constitution-wise, it doesn't do anything, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it's very complicated, but I just don't think it should be a necessary discussion this early in the administration stage.
They get plenty to deal with first. I get it. Lastly, with less than the 2 minutes we got left, what are your parting advice or the parting advice you would like to send to the new administration, Abdirizaq?
Yeah, so I think holding public office, the Prime Minister has to understand is a privilege and honor, right? So once you understand that, that could solve a lot of problems for him. The second thing is the assumption people are making is that because, again, although I have my own questions, because he is a local product, he has a better understanding of the dynamics of the conflict and what ails Somalia. So he has to step up. Obviously, being first again, there's a lot of excitement. So you have an opportunity, a small window to take advantage of that before the tide turns. So my first advice is, while you still have the public good on your side, take advantage of it and do big things, right? You have to make sure that security is your priority. As the first one from Jubaland, you have a special duty to make sure that that's a region that had a long conflict, and it's a battleground for a lot of proxy wars. A special duty for you to solve that, right? For President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud, what he has to worry about is often the second term is about leaving legacies, right? So you have to worry about what are you leaving behind that people will remember you, make them forget about your first time. So think about the legacy, right? Which means now that you selected your friend and someone that you're familiar with, you have a big shoes to fill. Again, I would argue security and ensuring that there's one person, one vote by the end of your term, right? So I think those are the main ideas. Peace and development would be third and fourth, but security, stability, taking advantage of that, the fact that you both are first one re-elected, first prime minister from both Jubaland and being a Somali local product, right? Take advantage of that specific features that comes with your new administration and then take it forward. Obviously, you have to deal with all the things that the opposition will try, but as long as you put Somali interests first, all will be good.
I appreciate that.
That's all I would say to that.
Excellent. I appreciate that, Abdirizaq Warfa, for joining us today and explaining what to look forward into this new administration of Somalia with President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud and his recently appointed prime minister and yet to be confirmed by Parliament, Hamze Abdi Barre. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Abdulqadir, for having me. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Always.